So I would like to welcome all of you to the 20th meeting of the 46th year of the Rotary Club of Dublin and Worthington. And this is, of course, a new year. 2021, we've begun, and this is our first meeting of this calendar year. With that, I would like to ask Tim. Tim, you have the both the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay.
So, Tim, and please silence the rest of us. Please silence our monitors.
Okay, would you pray with me? Dear Lord, as we embark on a new year, we pause to reflect on the year past. 2020 was a difficult year for all of us. Nonetheless, we give you thanks for the many blessings that you bestowed upon us, blessings that sustained us and helped us through, and for that we are truly grateful. As we pause to reflect on the potential and possibility of the new year before us, we pray that this would be a year of returning to normal. No matter what, we know that you will be right there beside us, guiding our steps. We thank you for Rotary and the opportunity to serve others. Help us to be mindful of and responsive to the needs of those around us. Be with and bless each person here this morning. In your name we pray. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Jim, you're on mute.
Steve, can you introduce any guests you have? And
Yes, looking around, I see no guests. So then I guess we'll go to Happy Dollars. And I'll say it for everybody. I'm happy that 2021 is over and that we're in, or no, 2020 is over and we're in 2021. So there's the dollar for that. Also, Peggy, I'm sorry. Peggy sent me a Santa Claus hat because apparently I didn't have one for the Christmas party and I left it at my office. So Peggy, thank you, but I'm sorry I forgot it at my office.
You're
Does
welcome.
anybody else have a happy dollar? What, Peggy?
No, you're welcome.
Oh.
It fits you much better than the last one you wore.
It's true.
I'm happy that the Buckeyes handed Clemson their lunch.
Absolutely.
Woohoo.
yeah,
Certainly with such a heavy discussion this morning, we can balance it out with some happy dollars. So Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a surrogate happy dollar for Jim. Jim, you have now made it halfway past your year as president.
thank
I know how
you.
that feels.
Yeah, it's been different.
Steve, I've got a happy dollar.
Fire it on us.
I am delighted that every 18 or 20 years the Browns go to the playoffs.
Steve, I'm happy to see George Norris here today. He has had his whole body rebuilt in the last 6 months, I think. George, how are you doing?
You're on mute, George.
George, you're on mute. Still on mute.
I think he broke his hand.
Yes, I had my left knee replaced 2 weeks ago yesterday. And my pain hasn't been very much at all, but I have to take enough of that oxycodone.
Oh.
I just hope it doesn't hook me. But it's going very well.
So George, is there anything left to do on your body? You've had 2 knees and a hip. I guess you may have another possibility of a hip replacement.
No, the other hip is working very well. My right shoulder's given me some problems. So
I think the next
I
thing
hope I can exercise out of that one.
a Darth Vader helmet. Isn't that what happens next?
Get a head replacement, George.
All right. It's good to see everybody. I'll turn it back over to you, Jim.
Well, now we can move on to announcements. I think several have been made as part of the Happy Dollars, but you may have an announcement.
I have an announcement. I just wanted everybody to be aware that past RI director Greg Yang passed away yesterday. He was our director. He passed away from COVID. He had decided that he didn't want to be put on a ventilator, so he died yesterday with his family by his side. And he was just a great, great guy and a wonderful Rotarian. And I just want everybody to please say a prayer for Catherine, his wife, and family.
Any other announcements?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do we have a way to go back through the auction items and find out what items were sold for?
Yeah, Shirley does. We can get the amount, and not necessarily the person, is my understanding. And I have
One of the donors asked me how much money the gift basket raised.
well, that we know because we sold it here. Shirley, could you unmute?
I can get with Shirley later. That's okay.
Okay. And that we auctioned off at the meeting.
Right.
Yeah.
Was that Rose speaking that wants who was
No,
that? The
yeah,
Teresa.
Teresa.
Teresa. Okay. Oh, okay, Teresa. I'll try to get that from Paula. I don't know. I know the final amount, but I'll try.
What was our final amount, by the way?
Wasn't it like 1,500, Jim?
Yes.
1,500.
Close.
But I mean, Paula was kind of the middle person, and I really am not in the know about that, but I can find out from her.
I'll email you specifically what I'm interested in.
Okay. Okay. Fine.
Thank you.
Any other announcements that we have? Okay. Well, today I'm very pleased to introduce one of our own members as our speaker, Doug Southgate. Doug has been a member of our club since 1994 and was president from 2014 to 2015. He was raised in Portland, Oregon, moved to the Midwest in 1975 and did his first graduate studies at the University of Wisconsin at that point.
First and last, Jim. First and
Pardon?
last. First and
First
last.
and
I
last.
understand so much.
And then in 1980, he took a position at the Ohio State University, where he served as a full professor in the agricultural economics department and specializes in international studies. His scholarly work is focused largely on his wife's home country of Ecuador, and he has carried out research, consulted or both in more than a dozen Latin American, Caribbean, and African nations. Doug will be speaking to us today regarding Portland and the assault on Portland, Oregon, which has been in the news, and he has gained a lot of his information and understanding, having been a resident there and communicating and keeping up with the more recent incidents. So Doug, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Appreciate the introduction. And I appreciate being able to speak about what has been happening the last several months in my hometown. But certainly I have to apologize in advance for the subject matter, which is disturbing indeed. Well, with this fair warning, let me plunge right in with a couple individual reports about individual incidents. One has to do with a barbecue restaurant owned and run by an uncle of Snoop Dogg. And Tom Rice and George Norris, Snoop Dogg is a rapper, although you might have seen him on cooking shows recently with Martha Stewart. Anyway, he lives in Portland and has, or better to say, had a business. After a neighboring business was leveled, this uncle expressed the hope that the perpetrators would be arrested and prosecuted. That was it. However, that was enough to offend the self-styled anti-fascist or Antifa movement. Shortly afterward, a young white woman, who by the way didn't bother to cover her face while appearing on a security camera, this young woman took it upon herself to strike a blow for Black Lives Matter, or BLM, by firebombing the restaurant belonging to a relative of Snoop Dogg. The other individual account is actually much worse. This concerns a young man who joined a march downtown in support of BLM. So he was definitely a peaceful, legitimate protester in support of BLM. However, he ended up with severe head injuries. These injuries were not the fault of the police or right-wingers. Instead, the young man was a victim of Antifa thugs who objected when he commiserated with an older gentleman who sat crying in front of his ransacked business. One of many people in that position in downtown Portland over the summer and into the fall. The beating the young man received severed an optic nerve, which left him permanently blind in one eye. And since his skull was shattered beyond repair, it had to be replaced with 6 metal plates. This young man is an acquaintance of my brother who for the time being still lives in Portland. Additional reports are easy to find on the internet, as are videos from reputable sources of the mayhem Portland suffered every night for months on end. I particularly commend, if you're interested, and this is in the summary of my remarks that's on the club website, there's an interview conducted by KGW, which is the local NBC affiliate. So don't worry, this is not Fox News or anything like that. KGW conducted an interview of an African-American who serves in the Portland Police Division. Officer Jackson was fortunate enough to survive unscathed when a commercial-grade firework was hurled at him during a nighttime riot. And all the riots occurred at night. Frequently after starting as reasonable, peaceful demonstrations during daylight hours. If you want to listen to his testimony, it's easy. All you have to do is Google, and again, this is shown in this summary that Toyota prepared. Just Google KGW Officer Jackson. Well, I could go on with sharing anecdotes with you, and anecdotes related to me by friends, by relatives, also by reading the press coverage. But I think it would be more useful for me just to provide some context for recent events and continuing trends in my beleaguered hometown. One thing to mention about Portland is that its African-American population is actually relatively small. It amounted to just 6.3% of all inhabitants counted in the 2010 census. The African-American share of the population, 2010 population, was a little higher in Seattle at 7.9%, and slightly lower in San Francisco. San Francisco's African-American population was 6.1% 10 years ago. In the Rose City, as Portland is called, Black people are outnumbered both by Latinos, 9.4% in 2010, and by Asians, 7.1%. To tell the truth, when I was growing up, the largest non-white group were Asian Americans, Chinese and Japanese principally. Well, with respect, so much for demography. With respect to economic topics, real estate costs about 50% more in Portland than in the Columbus area. At the same time, Portland prices are much lower than prices in San Francisco and Seattle, which turns out to be a plus for startup activity. There's a lot of startup activity in Portland. However, Nike and other major companies traditionally identified with the city have moved into the western suburbs. In fact, Portland is distinctive for being, for a city of its size. There's no other US city in its size class that has not a single Fortune 500 headquarters. When I was growing up, Georgia Pacific was there, other, various companies, but they've all moved out of Portland. One major reason for this, Oregon has the advantage of not having sales taxes, but its income taxes are among the highest in the country. And they make attracting and retaining businesses a challenge, particularly since there are no state income taxes just across the border, just a few miles away in Washington. And parenthetically, I should add, so our Miriam's and my kids want us to move out to Portland. Our son is there, and our daughter can visit us there just as easily as she can visit us here. And I think I have this worked out. I can live in Washington, pay no income taxes, and then do my shopping, just cross the bridge and do my shopping in Oregon, and pay no sales taxes. That way my conscience won't be bothered by my contributing any more money than I absolutely have to either of those state governments. But just to give you an idea of how high income taxes are in Oregon, married couples there with joint earnings above $71,000 pay a state income tax of 7%. The rate goes up to 9% if joint earnings exceed $178,000, and the top state income tax rate, which is 9.9%, rated 10%, kicks in at $250,000. And that means that actually in Oregon, upper middle class taxpayers pay much higher state income taxes than they would if they lived in California, which of course has a much higher top rate, but that top rate applies to the plutocrats in Silicon Valley and Beverly Hills and so forth, not so much to upper middle income taxpayers. My son, I mentioned he moved there, and he said he would, if he were still in San Francisco, and that's where he moved from, he would actually be paying lower state income taxes. Income taxes are going to factor in here. There's a new development I'll mention at the end of the presentation. So much for the economic factors. There are other factors that diminish the appeal of living and working in Portland, and they may not be as particularly easy to express in monetary terms, though they are important nevertheless. One such factor, which is also a problem everywhere else, in every other urban area in the West Coast, is a large homeless population that includes many individuals who are mentally ill, substance abusers, or both. There's a complex set of problems underlying this. One thing to mention is that, and some of you understand the law and the practice of providing services to these individuals. Aside from extreme cases, as I understand it, involuntary commitment to mental hospitals and rehabilitation facilities is not really an option. Okay, there are diversion programs out there that have been used pretty heavily, and for those of you unfamiliar with the term, diversion programs allow individuals who are facing incarceration, so they've broken a law. Those individuals facing incarceration are given the option of treatment for mental illness, substance abuse, or whatever. So that's the diversion. However, these diversion programs are being short-circuited because of a number of legal and policy developments. One is that prohibitions on the possession of drugs up to and including heroin in Portland, these prohibitions are being eliminated. Another part of this policy and legal development is that theft and other property crimes are not prosecuted provided the value of stolen or damaged property is less than several $100s. So the new district, let me illustrate this with another example. The new district attorney in Los Angeles, there's a fellow named George Gascon. In case you're interested, he's Cuban American. He won his election, beating the incumbent, who was an African American woman, as it turns out. But she had gotten crossways with the wokesters and others in her city, because she is actually a little bit tough on rioters, as was Police Superintendent Carmen Best in Seattle, who was on the television quite a lot this past summer. Anyway, George Gascon, who had been the DA down up in San Francisco, moved down to challenge the incumbent and beat her in the November election. He is now implementing in Los Angeles what he implemented in San Francisco, basically saying that if you shoplift, for example, and you steal anything worth less than $900, you don't have to worry about legal repercussions. So that's part of what's going on out there. And it's no coincidence that San Francisco and other West Coast cities have the worst incidence of property crime in the United States these days. Portland is right in step with these other cities, especially since the new district attorney for Multnomah County, that's where Portland is located. District attorney is only 39 years old, Mike Schmidt, so obviously too young to have played professional baseball. Anyway, as we knew him, that was the good Mike Schmidt. So this is the other Mike Schmidt. He is perfectly aligned with decriminalizing counterparts in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. And that's an interesting discussion in its own right. It's really no exaggeration to describe the decriminalization agenda as a surrender by the authorities of streets and other public places. Other public places, including all the parks and squares that Portland has spent tens of millions of dollars on establishing and improving in recent years. Those parks and squares are now largely campgrounds for the homeless. As Ro, I think you saw when you visited Portland a couple of years ago. Others have seen it. If you've been out to Portland, certainly San Francisco and Seattle, you see all these campgrounds around. A surrender of public spaces. There are other consequences of this, not least for the homeless themselves, who are victimized, of course, by drugs and psychosis and schizophrenia, but all too often violent assault as well. So the property crime rates are very high, and violent crimes are going up as well. There's another pair of documentaries that are mentioned in the blurb on the website. Again, these are not Fox News productions. These happen to be productions of the ABC affiliate in Seattle, which is KOMO, and one from 2019, which documents this misbegotten social experiment in Seattle, which is farther along than Portland's, truth be told. Anyway, that 2019 documentary is called Seattle is Dying. That's all you have to Google. The other one just came out late last year, late 2020. It's called The Fight for the Soul of Seattle. First one takes about an hour to watch, second one an hour and a half. Each of these documentaries, to be sure, makes for scary viewing. Well, the streets of Portland haven't been surrendered to the homeless alone. They are largely open to Antifa rioters as well. They've been coming out every May 1st for years. They celebrated, if that's the right word, the presidential election in 2016. When they choose to go out, there's not much to stop them. And much of the fault, it has to be said, lies with public officials. Perhaps the best known culprit is Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler, who is actually the son of an old Oregon family. He's sixth generation Oregonian, which is just about as far back as you can go. This family grew wealthy in the timber business, quite wealthy. And he has the degrees from Stanford, Harvard, and Columbia to show for it. Although what he learned in those places is beyond me. But he writes good policy papers. He more to the point, Wheeler is directly responsible for police operations although he never authorized adequate crowd control this year. In part, it has to be said, for fear of losing the November 3rd election. He was up for re-election in November. And his opponent was a Marxist, self-declared Marxist, and even worse, a full-throated supporter of Antifa. She declared in 2019, "I am Antifa." So that was the alternative. Republicans need not apply to be mayor of Portland, not in recent loving memory. Another culprit is Oregon Governor Kate Brown. Other than for a few days after the withdrawal of federal agents guarding the U.S. courthouse this summer, and I'm sure just about everyone listening in this morning saw the coverage of that. She never deployed the Oregon National Guard during that confrontation, and she did send the Guard in. That was part of the negotiated agreement to get the federal agents out of Portland. She deployed the Guard just for a few days, and then they withdrew. The riots resumed, and didn't visibly concern her. And then, of course, there's D.A. Schmidt. Soon after assuming office on August 10th, he was elected in the primary in May. He was sworn in early on August 10th. And practically the first thing he did was to drop charges against up to 1,000 individuals who had been arrested since late May for disorderly conduct, vandalism, et cetera, in previous weeks. And he's stuck with this practice. He did the same with, and this is part of so-called bail reform. I think I forgot to mention that. This is part of the surrender of the streets. The left-wing city attorneys out along the West Coast are opposed to cash bail. So there was an autonomous zone late in the year after the election, late November into early December. There was an autonomous zone established around a foreclosed house. And actually, Wheeler ordered the police in, and they cleared it out. They arrested 13 individuals. They all had, each one of them had a lengthy criminal record, but Schmidt let them all go, which is really too bad, because what intrigues me, if we know anything about hardened criminals, which is what these people were, and they had stockpiled arms and so forth in this autonomous zone. They don't do this at no charge. Somebody had to have been paying them, and I think the city of Portland would have benefited enormously from knowing who were, how much they got paid, and more to the point, who was paying them. But we'll never find out. Well done, D.A. Schmidt. Well, a few of the people I know in Portland, I want to, let's see, I've been going for, is anybody timing me? When an economist says something is going to be short and clear, he's lying at least once. I always get in trouble on this score, but I want to leave plenty of time for comments and questions. But let me just bring you up to date. I can't really blame just the elected officials. They are convenient targets, and Wheeler in his statements has just been feckless. He barely beat his pro-Antifa opponent. That's how disenchanted people are with him. However, I have to fault the electorate out in Portland. Schmidt got 75% of the vote, for DA this year, and the pro-Antifa candidate got more than 40% of the vote in Portland. So enough said about the electorate there. So the wounds in Portland are, it has to be admitted, are largely self-inflicted, and I'm pessimistic. I would say the prospects for a speedy recovery in Portland are poor. Just 4 points. Point one: in the wake of rioting, insurance premiums, as you might imagine, have skyrocketed. The most recent report I saw indicated a 5-fold increase in insurance premiums. But that's not the worst of it. A lot of businesses are having their policies canceled and are unable to find substitute coverage. So as you might imagine, this is accelerating the exodus of businesses from Portland. Point two, with strong electoral support in Multnomah County, the state of Oregon revoked legal restrictions on the possession of limited amounts of heroin and other drugs. So one must expect that this so-called reform will cause the ranks of drug addicts living on the streets of Portland to go up, I suppose, not down. Point 3, maintaining public order in the face of all this will be a greater challenge since the budget for the Portland Police Division has been cut by 10% so far. Retirements and even resignations from the force are well above normal levels. And I was talking to my brother, again, a Portland resident, a lifelong Portland resident, who dearly loves his city, and he just put his house on the market. He said, "Look," and he lives in a very nice, has to be one of the safest neighborhoods in Portland. Maybe he's excessively worried, but he said we can't be sure if we call the police, who are very hard pressed these days. If we put in a 911 call, we're not sure we'll even get through, or if there will be a response. Again, there are extraordinarily high levels of property crime. And then finally, point 4, Multnomah County, again, that's where Portland is located, has approved the creation of a new county level income tax on top of the state income tax, the federal income tax, of course. And the purpose of this is to underwrite free daycare and preschool for all. So this is sort of the Bernie Sanders model, so new social programs that are financed by making the rich pay their fair share. Thank you, Senator Sanders. And but the thing is, in Portland, as Margaret Thatcher once said about this approach, eventually you run out of rich people. Portland is definitely running out of rich people. Nowadays, a lot of middle-class households are reconsidering just how much they really want to live in the Rose City. Well, I'll close by sharing with you the latest news, which is that Antifa demonstrated shortly after midnight on the 1st, so less than a week ago, that it has no plans to go away, not quietly at least. 100 or so thugs gathered downtown, hurling water bottles, frozen water bottles, and rocks at police, along with a couple Molotov cocktails. I'm sad to report, though I'm not surprised, that there were no arrests. However, this might have been the last straw. A slight note of optimism here. This incident might have been the last straw for Mayor Wheeler. And I will just simply close before we open it up for comments and questions by reading the statement he made just a few hours after that riot, after daybreak on the 1st. And so I quote, "It will be necessary to use additional tools and to push the limits of the tools we already have, tools for riot control, to bring criminal destruction and violence to an end." So he's no longer dodging what's really going on in the city. Continuing in the same vein, "Lawlessness and anarchy come at great expense and at great risk to the future of our community. It's time to push back harder against those who are set on destroying our community and to take more risks in fighting lawlessness. I condemn anyone who engages in violence or criminal destruction, no matter what their ideology." That's Mayor Ted Wheeler on January 1st, not a Fox News talking head in July. Okay. That's it.
Any questions?
Are there? I see the chat function is people are chatting.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the questions I have relates to the impact of COVID. A great deal of, especially homeless population, it's very difficult to control or to work with that group. And do you have any information about the impact of that during this entire disruption? We haven't heard much about that.
I haven't either.
Okay.
They're still living out on the streets. I mean, it's there's sort of an ethos in the West Coast. It's a very liberal area. People think of themselves as liberal and tolerant, right? But in terms of what happens to homeless people, it's just extraordinarily callous. And it's shocking. One person I know who was shocked by this, Miriam and I became very good friends with a young Turkish woman during my sabbatical in Germany. We've stayed in touch with her. Well, you know, she took her first trip to the United States. She went to a conference in San Francisco, and after that experience, she wrote, she said, "Oh, San Francisco is a beautiful city. She had a great time, but what is going on with these homeless problems? This is just, so it's worse on the West Coast than it is elsewhere in the United States. And honestly, it's worse than what you see in other parts of the world. It's a disgrace. And these are San Francisco is certainly one of the richest cities in the world. It's a-
Tom Rice, what I don't understand about the whole thing in Portland and San Francisco with all these homeless people, I'm sure some of them have a real psychological problem, but you know, and everybody knows I'm a conservative. I don't know why in the hell the government officials of those communities don't spend the money, instead of spending the money ridiculously on some of the things that they do, and build some very nice multi-housing barracks, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
With nice facilities, kitchens, showers. You know, hell, I lived in a barracks when I was in the Army, and put those people in there and get them out from the front of these people's businesses who can't do business. The people, as we've heard, just litter the streets with their own stuff, if you will.
You don't need
It
to
just
finish that
blows my
sentence.
mind that
Yeah.
this country is like a third world country in those places. It makes me sick.
Well, you're not the only one. By the way, it's not a side point. It's not just businesses. A friend of mine retired after a career in the Multnomah County Library System, and she worked part of the time in the downtown library. This is a beautiful library, one of these Carnegie, you know, from the early 1900s, Carnegie financed libraries. It's an architectural gem. It's been worked up by the New York Times. It's basically, well, there are your barracks, Tom. It's a barracks. The homeless are not supposed to sleep there, but my friend, a diminutive woman, I'd have to admit, she wasn't very enthusiastic about, you know, tapping some homeless guy who was snoring away at the table to get him to move out. So they've taken that over. This is part of the surrender of public spaces. To be fair to those communities, Tom, what they're dealing with out there is, at least in part, a national problem. So homeless people move out to the West Coast. I mean, if you were homeless and had a choice between spending December, January, and February in Minneapolis versus San Francisco or even Seattle, you know where you would go. So you get some relocation that way, so the homeless problem has grown beyond the dimensions, the financial dimensions, among other things, that the local governments can deal with. But there's another problem. There's a policy problem. This came up because a few years ago, so our son spent a year, a fellowship year in San Francisco, and his sister came over from Amsterdam. Now, you know, we know Amsterdam's reputation. It's not as wide open as what people think. But it's fairly wide open. It's very liberal and so forth. But she was shocked to see all what was going on there. And this is at least a PG-13 story. One evening we went out with her, all four of us. So our son, our daughter, Miriam, and myself. And we parked the car and we were walking along on the way to a restaurant. We looked down an alley, and there was some chap with, you know, standing up with his trousers down around his ankles. And all that my daughter could say was, well, at least he's not masturbating. And you take what you could get in San Francisco. But this seeing these things in San Francisco motivated my daughter. She didn't remember seeing anything like the same homeless problem in Amsterdam. She went back the long and the short of it, and I'm sure Jim, some other members, you and some other members of the committee probably know about more about this, but what she found out is that they don't have the same homeless problem in the Netherlands, in part because of a better social safety net. That has to be admitted. So if you're young and if you have mental illness and you have mental illness or some condition, the authorities will help you get through as much schooling as you can handle. They will line up a job that you can handle. They'll line up housing, Spartan, but like your old barracks, Tom, though with your own room. All of that. It's all well and good, but also in the Netherlands, if you are one of those people, if you're a beneficiary of the safety net, you have somebody that you have to report to, and they are going to check to make sure that you take your med, and you don't have a choice in the matter. And so this is what my daughter found out by talking to her Dutch friends. And I happened to mention this to someone that I ran into who's involved in homeless advocacy or trying to provide services to them. And I said, well, I suppose that just reflects our independent mindset, our freedom-oriented mindset in the United States. And this individual said, yes, that's true, but also a cardinal principle of federal grant programs, and the feds really call the shots. If the feds decide you do something a certain way, then all other granting agencies, nonprofit, private granting agencies, trot in line behind the feds. A cardinal principle is client choice. The clients here are the homeless people, and they get to choose whether they take their medication to keep their schizophrenia under control and so forth. And these drugs have side effects, and a lot of people, there's schizophrenics, and they decide not to take them. So this is our policy, and it relates in part, to the whole deinstitutionalization movement from 40 years. Again, this is a topic that other people here are dealing with. So you have a national problem. Just a recap. You have a national problem that is now concentrated in parts of the country, not just the West Coast, but certainly including the West Coast. And then you have this policy issue of being able to force people to get treatment. This is, Tommy, I highly recommend, and Tom and anyone else, this Como ABC affiliate documentary from December, The Fight for the Soul of Seattle, addresses it really gets into the weeds of all these problems and why you can't deal with this. One person in that documentary, by the way, I was thinking of this as you were making your comment. One person is somebody who actually escaped the streets, who was drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. And she actually cleaned herself up, became an honor student at University of Washington, which as a graduate of the University of Oregon doesn't necessarily impress me that much, but she is very impressive. And she said, well, you can't just house them. Housing alone isn't the solution. She said, then they will take all their behaviors, all their dysfunctional behaviors, and carry them out behind closed doors. So it's more than just giving them barracks, although that's certainly a necessary part of the solution.
Well, Doug, I would add to my comments is that I would provide them social workers or whoever you want to put in there to give them an opportunity to learn some kind of trade, if you will, or get their act together so that they can find a job and get them out of that situation. I wouldn't just put them there in a building and let them sit there and enjoy the fruits of better living conditions. I would, I don't know how you require something. And some of these people are lost causes. Some of them truly have a psychological problem that probably can't be fixed. And I have no facts to back my next comment up, but I'd say more than half of them are on the dole, and they don't give a shit. And it just drives me crazy.
These people probably fall outside the welfare system. That's my sense.
I do have some information because recently I have a friend and a friend of my daughter who actually was in Bend, And they went to Portland because they were told that that was the only hospital that they could do. And it was not that impossible to force. In fact, I was very surprised that they could do much easier forced admission into a hospital. But the system itself, the mental health system that in Oregon is horrid. It was a horrid experience there. 3 admissions inside of that many weeks. And eventually what happened is they flew all the way over to Boston. And that's where they eventually got treatment. And he did much better in Massachusetts. It was such a night and day experience for his wife. It was horrid in terms of the expertise and abilities of people providing that service, and the availability of the service period on an outpatient basis was extremely low. So one of the things is the fact that if you don't have a good mental health system that's supporting, what happens is that you either have to jail people, which is a problem in itself, or they become, they go to the street. And the deinstitutionalization in this country was, the promise was never kept, that folks coming out of state institutions, the money would follow them. And that's one of the basic issues here, is that some communities just do not have service, and especially more rural, and some of the larger cities just have an extremely poor service.
I would imagine in Portland, they're just overwhelmed.
Well, it may be that they're overwhelmed, but that was throughout the state. They were referred there because supposedly you could get better service, and that was, and this is a physician, and we're not talking about someone who doesn't know health system.
And he has a spouse too, right?
No, it's she. The spouse is the one that, and she did the advocacy, and it was horrible how she was treated and how he was treated.
Yeah.
And the sophistication was extremely poor.
I have a comment. I think that what we need to focus on is making sure that Columbus, Ohio does not become a Portland. And came up in my mind when we mentioned libraries. It seems to me if we spend, and I don't know, Chuck, how you feel about it, if we spend some time at the downtown main library in Columbus, we will run into more street people than we ever do on a daily basis doing anything else. Go to Sullivan Avenue, go to Cleveland Avenue. That's right here around us. And we need to focus on what we can do in Columbus, Ohio, and learn from what happened in other places. That's my take.
Where are all the experts who deal with people of this kind of situation? Where are they at, and why aren't they out there trying to solve this problem? I mean, I'm no psychologist, I'm no psychiatrist. I mean, why? There are professionals everywhere in this city. We have a mayor who is, I don't have much respect for, but where are they trying to, one, move these people out of the library, which I've heard your comment before, Bonnie, where they're using that as their station in life during the day, which is wrong.
Exactly.
And why are they getting away with it? And where are the people that are supposed to enforce this kind of non-activity? I don't get it.
I don't either. I go to the Parsons branch, which is 2 blocks from my house. There's a street person on the telephone every time I walk in that place. And I don't know who that person is talking to, but I always hear them say, well, I don't have any money to do this. I don't have any money to do that. You know, and I just want to say, go get a job, but they probably can't hold down a job. But we got to make sure that it doesn't happen here worse or equivalent to what's happening in Portland, as far as I'm concerned.
I
If I could
just
offer,
want
go ahead, Katie, and I'll